happy to have you, Adriana. Thank you very much. Adriana is the president of the Habitat International Coalition, or HIC as we call it, and a professor of development planning and urban sustainability at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at UCL, University College London. And she is from Argentina, but she will be presenting in English to facilitate our translation. She's an academic and activist with over 35 years of international experience in research, pedagogy, advocacy, advisory, and capacity building in over 30 countries across the global South. And I interacted with Adriana at HIC through CUBES in the Women and Habitat and Africa Working Group. And I'm delighted to invite you, Adriana, and thank you so much for making this work. Before I give the floor to you, I also wanted to thank you very much to HIC, to the incredible team of women working at HIC for hosting our event today, for making this broadcast, and for being here with us. Thank you so much. So with that, Adriana, I think we start with the film. Is that what you would like to do?
Let me just say a few words. Perhaps we can start with the slides, the first slides, and then move into the film, if you're okay with that.
Okay.
But
yes,
before anything else, well, just to say many thanks, Priscilla, and many thanks to all the organizers for this amazing conference. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to join the previous sessions, and it was due to a combination of health and traveling. But I'm really glad to be now with you today, and very much looking to the discussion that will follow. In order to keep to the time, which is not one of my strengths, I'm going to read a few notes that I put together for today's session, so that we can definitely have at least 20 minutes for discussion. So perhaps we can start. I just want to, just before we move into a film that we put together, I just want to say a few things about what I'm proposing to do. So what I would like to do with you is explore the struggles that marginalized women and girls face in the process of transforming their own territories by focusing on sanitation, that is on the management of bodily fluids, and more specifically on the experiences of those women, girls, men, and boys living off-grid across urban Africa. In doing so, if we move to the next slide, I'm going to draw from an action research project that I led over the last 4 years called Overdue, Tackling the Sanitation Taboo Across Urban Africa. And this is just to say that the project started back in 2020, and it initially brought together a number of amazing organizations, academic and non-academic organizations, working very closely with grassroots organizations in the cities of Beira in Mozambique, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and Mwanza in Tanzania. All of them with a very long trajectory in advancing sanitation for all, but not necessarily in deploying a feminist perspective. Soon after the beginning, and thanks to one of my colleagues, Claudie Houet, who is here with us today, we were joined by 4 further organizations that are all listed there. Feminist organizations from Abidjan in Ivory Coast, St. Louis in Senegal, Antananarivo in Madagascar, and Bukavu in DRC. And what was amazing was to have throughout these 7 cities and city teams an extraordinary exchange, not only in terms of knowledge, but very much in terms of really populating, if you wish, the perspective of each other. So what I'm going to share has a lot to do with that incredible energy that emerged from the 7 groups with whom we work. If we go to the next, just to give you a very brief overview of what the Overdue project was about. The project had a main purpose was threefold. On the one hand, our aim was to reframe sanitation across urban Africa from a feminist perspective, and to do so by unpacking the historical and colonial narratives that underpin the sanitation taboo. That was, in other words, to enable a 360-degree perspective on what equitable urban sanitation means, that is, what matters to whom and why, including an in-depth exploration of what sanitation infrastructure promises do and actually deliver across different colonial legacies and post-colonial conditions. In the second place, what we did, our aim was to produce also actionable knowledge, not just to know more for the sake of it, but to produce actionable knowledge based on a reevaluation of gender sanitation experience, practices, and investments across the continuum between the large-scale infrastructural interventions that focus typically on grid systems and the incremental practices and investments made by the urban poor collectively and individually to produce off-grid sanitation facilities and services. Last but not least, our aim was to take stock of ongoing experimentation towards what we call just sanitation and to foster regional dialogue and exchange. And we did that by engaging with multiple women and men, girls and boys, who build, use, run, and maintain off-grid sanitation systems. And in doing so, we aim to generate insights and co-learning experience across the 7 cities where we work. In a nutshell, our objective through the Overdue project was to peel off, if you wish, layer after layer, the multiple and deeply gendered taboos that inhabit sanitation, as well as many other critical lifelines across the urban global south, and to do that from a feminist perspective. We set up to do this by exploring the sanitation taboo and understanding that not just as a set of social and cultural norms regulating the flow of bodily fluids, basically poo, wee, and blood, but also by extending our gaze to the institutional and professional practices that reinforce gender taboos, while seeking to advance a human right to sanitation for all, a right that we have to remember was only enacted back in 2010 by the United Nations. If we move now to the next slide, what we see is there is a bit of a timeline of how sanitation has been approached over the years, or at least over the last few decades in international fora and regional fora. And what we can see is that despite the commitments expressed by African leaders through the NGOR declaration back in 2015, that was a commitment, a pledge to achieve universal access to adequate and sustainable sanitation and hygiene services and the elimination of open defecation by 2030. Let's remember again that all these commitments were later endorsed by the international community through the Sustainable Development Goals, and more specifically through the Sustainable Development Goal 6. What we see is that the sanitation crisis, or the so-called sanitation crisis, is still far from vanishing in African cities. As such, when we talk about the right to sanitation, we witness a massively prevailing violation of human rights, which is endured daily by at least 60%, and this is a very conservative figure, of the urban population in Africa and 2.4 billion people all over the world. While we know that sanitation supports urban life in all its forms, it continues to be invisibilized, instinctively avoided, systematically untackled, and at best, if you wish, reduced to a cultural, technical, or financial problem. In the rich historical interrogation of the global sanitation crisis, Black and Fawcett, in a book that I recommend, frame this crisis as a taboo, and a spoken subject across almost every culture. In other words, they highlight that we talk, plan, and manage cities and urban life as if feces and urine were not part of them. And indeed, sanitation has been historically relegated to a taboo, an unpleasant topic rarely tackled in its own right and complexity, and pushed aside in favor of water-based sewage systems and water-intensive hygiene practices. And this is part of what we wanted to challenge through the project. Together with this, the emphasis of most pledges and interventions that we can see on the slide to advance sanitation over the years has been very much focused on physical and affordable access, underplaying not only the multiple roles that sanitation has in women's and girls' lives, but also their own role in sustaining the sanitation systems that keep a large portion of people alive across African cities and more widely across the urban global south. In the time we have together, what I would like to do is to focus our gaze on three typically overlooked dimensions across the many disciplines and practices and professions that aim explicitly or implicitly to address sanitation injustices. Those sides are the sides of bodies, practices, and things. And I would like to start by sharing a short video kindly collated by another colleague present today, Nadine Coetze. Many thanks, Nadine, for doing that. What the video does is, again, to put together a number of testimonies and observations among many more that we have collected over the project. And I just want to use this. It just takes about 10 minutes, a bit less than 10 minutes, to kick off the discussion. Let's start with the video. So that was the previous one, Priscilla. And one before that. That's it.
Adriana, can I close this one and open the video directly?
Sure, do that. Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want to go from here.
No worries.
So just a second, please. I think I'm going to have to stop sharing and then share again.
Priscilla, I think that the sound is not working.
Voilà, et puis c'est pas sécurisé. Donc, si on peut faire pour spécialement pour les femmes dans notre quand une femme est dans les toilettes, on dit qu'on ne doit pas entendre de bruit de ce qu'elle est en train de faire dans les toilettes. Quand elle fait pipi, on ne doit pas entendre. Quand elle fait des gaz, ça ne doit pas être audible. Quand elle sort des toilettes, on ne doit pas sentir d'odeur. Quand tu rentres, un homme peut te surprendre là-dedans. Voilà, et puis c'est pas sécurisé. Donc, si on peut faire pour spécialement pour les femmes. Dans notre école, là, il y a eu des bouchements de toilettes. Et ils ont fermé tous les toilettes. Les gens partaient souvent se soulager dehors. J'ai eu mes règles en classe et ça m'a sali. Je n'ai pas de coin à me changer. Donc, je me suis rendue directement à la maison, aller me changer. Donc, le lendemain, je me suis gênée, je n'ai pas pu me rendre à l'école. On a pris l'habitude de passer d'abord, puis après, elles pourront gérer comme nous, les hommes, serons déjà passés. Caca me sert. Mon homme aussi est là, m'a dit, selon moi, il doit me laisser rentrer parce que c'est pas facile. Bon, c'est selon toi, mais qu'est-ce qui se fait? Dans les cours communes, on a tendance à dire que les hommes doivent passer avant que les femmes n'aient accès aux toilettes.
Après aussi, le passage des femmes, quand les hommes veulent rentrer dans les toilettes, ils disent que les toilettes sont sales, c'est pas bon, parce qu'une femme est passée avant eux.
On dit si quelqu'un est dans la douche, si tu es déshabillé, si on t'appelle, on ne répond même pas. Même si quelque chose va gâter là, la personne va s'arrêter pour parler. Mais toi, tu es dedans, tu ne peux pas répondre.
Des fois, notre mari, quand ils font les fétiches là, quand tu as tes menstrues, tu ne dois pas t'approcher d'eux. Il ne doit pas voir le sang. D'autres refusent même de manger la nourriture de leurs femmes. Ils ne doivent pas dans le même lit avec les femmes. C'est les fétiches qui demandent ça.
Chez nous, les musulmans, tu ne dois pas toucher ton mari. Il te dit que c'est ça. Donc, brouhaha, tu ne peux pas toucher le brouhaha, tu ne peux pas prendre l'eau pour mettre dans le brouhaha. C'est une autre personne qui ne voit pas ses menstrues. Tu peux prendre l'eau pour mettre dans le brouhaha pour aller dans la douche pour mettre l'eau dans le seau. Les lacs de prière, tu ne peux pas toucher aussi.
On a tendance à dire, quand une dame est dans les toilettes, qu'elle ne doit pas parler, parce que si elle parle à un homme au dehors, c'est pas bon, c'est comme si elle trompait son mari avec lui, ou bien bon, d'autres aussi font tendance à la religion pour dire non, c'est pas bien, c'est comme si on voit ta nudité étant dans la toilette et puis tu t'adresses à quelqu'un du dehors, c'est comme si tu étais nu, bon, il sait pas, il y a trop de trucs qui disent, quand tu travailles trop tôt dans les toilettes, ils ont des préjugés. Ils ont des préjugés. Aujourd'hui, c'est là tout est. Ou bien il y a quoi? Ou bien, en tout cas, il y a des préjugés. Chacun interprète ça de la manière qu'il veut.
Autrefois, nos parents nous disaient qu'une femme enceinte ne pouvait pas se laver dans la nuit. Un chasseur était allé en brousse, tardivement dans la nuit pour chasser, et a entendu une femme génie en train d'expliquer à son mari que l'enfant était tout le temps malade. On n'avait pas de remède, mais l'enfant ne meurt pas. Donc, il y a une dame au village qui se lave à tout moment pendant la nuit. Donc, elle va aller au village, trouver cette dame et changer l'enfant. Le mari, ayant entendu les propos, a couru à la maison. Arrivé à la maison, trouvé sa femme avec le seau d'eau. Donc, elle a renversé le seau d'eau et puis attrapé sa femme, aller à la maison, lui dit de ne pas se laver cette nuit. Donc, le lendemain matin, il a révélé le secret. C'est pourquoi traditionnellement, on dit aux gens qu'il ne faut pas qu'une femme enceinte se lave pendant la nuit. Sinon, les génies viennent pour changer les bébés.
góor ki day taxal ku jigéen ki day taxal te ku doog ba pare ba jóg war nga mën a xëcc chaise bi bu fekkee am na chaise nga mu wàcc mu vidéo wala boog nga jël soo bi nga vidé ko mu dem.
non ñun suñu dëkk moom jigéen ñay defar xalaatuñu sax yàq ba defar dangay wala dangay defar ñu ñëw yàq dem seen yoon.
suñu kër de góor ñi dañ ko defar certes bu fekkee kii bi bouché na kano bi bouché na mais ñu jigéen ñi ñoom ñoo koy defar.
Suñu kër toilette yi fi am mooy genre toilette moderne yi chaise anglaise chasse ak lavabo et tout famille la noonu nekkuma sama kër bopp famille la toilette yi xanaa ñun jigéen ñi ñoo ko res ñoo koy defar.
jigéen moo war a xëy bale këram ba mu set ma fobee rek doog a jublu ci taalam añam ak yooyu sanga xale yi defar kër gi ba mu baax ku ñëw moom doo ko doon góor a ko war a def jigéen nga naa moo ko war a def léegi nag bu ko ci borom këram mënee jàppale wutal ko jànq ba tey baax na su fekkee doolem yeggu caatam yow mi nga xam ne yaa ne ci kër gi yaa ko war a seer yaa ko war a defar ba mu baax.
jigéen moo war a yow fajar teel bale kër gi ba mu set raxas duus yi mais nekkul jigéen kese ko def góor yàlla moom war na ko def ndax jigéen am na fu muy toll du attan doole du mën a liggéey yooyu quoi góor ko mën a def.
jigéen ki moo ko war a seer mu wut ay liggéeykat yu koy defaral ñu koy financé waaye duus yi moom nga bu oto moo koy nga ci suuf loolu suñu soog am duus kii koy gée yóbbu dex ga loolu mooy suñu jàng xale yi ñooy maas day boo xam ne day taalibe bu la fompal nga fay ko góor ñi moo xëy dañuy liggéey dañuy amee kër gi kóot me passé me menace bi togg léegi yëpp bu la ko xale yi jàpp ko man ko la ko jàpp ne mu defaree la kon bu simple la am ñu carré ndax bëgg na toog kay toog si kaw bëgg nañ ko waaye moyen bi ma amul moyen sama kër ba da koy topp da koy xale bu ma fobee rek wala xale bu ma raxta rek am na kenn ko fay ki ma fay rek dus bi fexe nga ko nga ci rek xale yi ñooy raxas dus bi laa seen yaay yi raxas sama doom fa nekk samay doom laa fa nekk ak samay sët xale yi raxas saa wala seen yaay raxas
bu fekkee comme Sénégal société bi ni mu tëddeewoo jigéen lañ ko jagleel mais bu jëmee ci wàllu force yi nag góor ñi parce que ñoo am force bi te fii nii booy xool ñoom dañu jël tâche ménagère yëpp daal di koy jagleel jigéen parce que nee nañu jigéen dafa war a nekk femme au foyer moo tax lu ñëw rek ci kawam lay daanu.
xam nga góor ñi rëy na rëy koo xam ne mën na dugg ci duus def nañ ci def waaye duñ ko raxas waaw moom dañu rëy si loolu ñu jagleel xale yi ñuy raxas dafa dus moom sa daal lay raxas dus moom sa góor ñi moom kon ci raxasal dus man xamal naa ndax man maa lay raxasal dus waaw moom ay jigéen ñi fi nekk jigéen ñi dafa
may raxas dus yi toppatoo suñu kër parfois xam maa fi nekk samay rakk yi mun ñu liggéey affaire maa nekk fii bàyyi fabee da yëkkati lu takk ma xool lu takk ma raxas dus yi toppatoo lu fi takk ma defar.
waaw bu fekkee entretien la moom il faut que nga dégager benn bibliothèque noonu à côté soit ci boutique bi nga koy teg wala nga jox ko kenn ci kër gi koo xamante ne loolu rek lay gérer pour ñu jënd li nga xamante ne moo koy entretenir les produits.
ndax parfois dina am ay saltement yu fi ne nga bale ton defar madaar eau de javel ndox raxas kaw suuf après nga lenkani daal di demaat ci beneen bi raxas parce que fii ñaari douche la damay dem defar ndox omo eau de javel daal di dugg raxas génnaat.
ñun nag suñu kër moom dañoo ñeme raxas mais dinañ ko raxas au moins 2 fois par jour bu fekkee xale yi nekkuñu fa.
parfois ma raxas fii ba pare xet bi day métti sama bopp.
So what I want to do is to draw on some of the things we saw, the things we heard in the video, and a few others, and build a few reflections on these 3 sides that I mentioned at the beginning: bodies, practices, and things. And in doing so, I want to depart from or remind ourselves of the notion of people as infrastructure, a notion coined by Malik Simon, which has changed, I would say, quite drastically the way in which we look at infrastructure. Let me remind us for a second how he defines this notion. He says people as infrastructure refers to the incessantly flexible, mobile, and provisional intersections of people that operate without clearly delineated notions of how the city is to be inhabited and used. And I want to depart from this notion, but make a more explicit feminist perspective and take on it than Simone. And in doing that, stop in those 3 sides: bodies, practices, and things. So if we go to the next one, Priscilla. Let me start by an exploration of how women and girls' bodies intersect the production of sanitation. And when I say that, I don't just mean biological bodies, but fundamentally social and political bodies. In dealing with their bodily fluids and those of others, most women and girls across urban Africa encounter all forms of violence on a daily basis. I'm talking about other forms of violence that those typically recognize in the field of sanitation, not just the violence of lacking access to improved facilities or adequate sanitation, the violence of being forced to defecate in the open if you lack the means to pay for a toilet as you go, or the violence of facing sexual harassment while releasing yourself. I'm talking about the violences and injustices produced and reproduced through the socially constructed norms that paradoxically are enforced to protect their bodies. One key feeling running throughout all the testimonies shared in the video and many others across the 7 cities where we work is that of women's bodies being disgusting. Control over women's bodily fluids extends to the disgust they face if they make noise or produce a smell as they release themselves, or give away their nakedness while being at the toilet. Women's bodies become dirty bodies, cheating bodies that should be controlled and regulated at all costs, without the chance to even escape social scrutiny in the privacy of a toilet. Women's bodies are not only offensive because of the gases, noises and smell they produce when they poo and wee, but also because they menstruate. Menstruation is one of the sites where control is exercised with utter violence, ruling the separation, as we saw throughout some of the testimonies, and isolation of menstruating bodies from others, even those in the most inner circles. As we talk to women in the field, we pursue the power of conscientization, aiming to trigger such process by breaking the feeling that what is happening to their bodies is an isolated experience. The journey from the individual to the collective experience is critical to resist and contest all forms of domination and violence, not just those that are recognized by others. In short, this marks a difference between others defining and controlling our bodies and us doing so. For instance, a toilet is not just a place to wee and poo. For women, it is also a place of privacy and intimacy, a place to look at yourself in a mirror, a place to care for yourself. One key insight from the testimonies we heard is that it is not just the diversity of sanitation practical needs of users that matters. While women are systematically seen at best as infrastructure users, they actually build, repair, run, and maintain the services they provide. In other words, they are not just sanitation users, they are sanitation providers. This means that what matters in the most is not what infrastructures and services are, but what they do or don't do for people. If we now move to the side of practices, through the multiple field encounters with women and girls, we found that dealing with sanitation involves not only heavy and risky tasks and long hours every day, but also a heavy mental workload, which is typically overlooked. Unfortunately, in the development field, sanitation is not just typically approached as a sector, but as a deeply masculinized sector or set of practices, in which, as mentioned before, women and girls are at best featured as users, with a reduced set of practical needs to be considered. Acknowledging the role they play as sanitation producers, and indeed as everyday city makers, involves unmasking their unpaid work, typically framed as care or duty, as a social construction reproduced not just through social and cultural norms, and I emphasize this, not just through social and cultural norms, but through development interventions and health campaigns. Looking at their everyday practices as sanitation producers reveals another side of marginalization and subordination that relegates women to support urban lives as their duty. The continuity of the confinement of women's work as reproductive work can be seen under different colonial and post-colonial eras, as wonderfully explained by Faranak yesterday. But it is also important to notice other marginalized and stigmatized bodies whose practices converge in the daily making of sanitation across urban Africa. One of the women in the video we watched talk about how, when possible, they seek the help of talibés In many urban centers in Senegal and in other parts of West Africa, with large Muslim populations, it is common to use young boys begging in the streets, often young boys begging in the streets, often clutching empty tins in which they collect donations of money, food, and other items. These boys are often referred to as talibés, a Wolof term which, etymologically speaking, comes from the Arabic talib, meaning seeker of knowledge in the Quran. Colloquially, the term talibé is often used to refer to those who beg, despite recognition that many children studying the Quran do not beg, while children who are assumed not to be learning the Quran are frequently still labeled as talibés. Talibés who beg are differentiated from other boys on the basis of assumptions of criminality, while in reality, often work as an extension of women's bodies to deal with some of the most challenging tasks of removing sludge from manual pit latrines. Many other bodies perform similar tasks, such as those referred as the frogmen that we see on the slide here. And this is a term used across urban Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. While across the West, the term frogmen is used to describe those who are trained in scuba diving or swim underwater, often for military purposes. Across many African cities, frogmen or biura in Swahili are those who dive into pit latrines to empty them manually. Their job entails diving in pit latrines with buckets and a shovel as they dig out compacted fecal sludge by hand. While they perform a critical job in stopping feces from flooding with shit the homes of the majority of people living in the so-called informal or unplanned settlements, they are systematically criminalized and stigmatized. For this reason, they perform their job at night and under dehumanizing conditions. In Freetown, we found that frogmen go through a ritual of self-intoxication to perform their task, which involves consuming a number of alcohol sachets before, during, and after emptying a pit latrine. The job takes about 6 hours for a single latrine and requires a group of at least 3 men. In Tanzania, they risk imprisonment and also face fines equivalent to half of their collective earning, which again, in the case of Tanzania and centers like Dar es Salaam, comes to about $40 US. Like the majority of women and girls living in off-grid settlements, talibés and biuras are the de facto sanitation infrastructure of most African cities, while in doing so, encounter all forms of violence and physical and mental illness. Their bodies are the constant target of all forms of control. Finally, let me move into a reading of the things that bridge bodies and practices to produce sanitation. Infrastructure is typically seen as a vast physical and technical complex of things, pipes, toilets, treatment plants, and so on, that, in the case of sanitation, ensure the flow of fecal matter away from our bodies in a distance elsewhere, pushing the threat of disease away from our homes and neighborhoods somewhere else. But material infrastructure also encompasses the norms, techniques, practices, legal tools, and social relations that underpin sociability and political belonging. As seen as heard throughout the short video that I shared earlier, decisions about infrastructure do not only affect the built environment. Infrastructure also regulates bodies, behaviors, and people. Infrastructure actively gives rise to different individual and collective subjects and distributes highly differentiated life opportunities. By looking at things, I refer to the importance of looking at the material world. This means looking at the way in which bodies, practices, and things get entangled and co-produce each other to either constrain or expand people's spatial and political agency across the territories of a body, the house, the household, the neighborhood, and the city. As highlighted at the beginning, historically, there has been a significant bias in the sanitation sector towards certain things, that is towards the modern network sewage systems that transport human waste from flush toilets into treatment plants, the grid sanitation systems that only serve a very small percentage of the population living across African cities. This disregard for the things, people, and practices that make the off-grid sanitation universe is not incidental. It follows a pattern of differentiation and segregation initiated across Africa during colonial times, which persists in the post-colonial era. Throughout the Overdue project, we trace infrastructure promises and investments over time, and found the systematic consolidation of the colonial distinction between what is called the cane city and the concrete city, that is, between the quarters of the city inhabited by those serving the site of the colonial occupants. Even today, the bulk of infrastructural investments go into the old cement city, now occupied by the elites, with trillions of dollars annually invested globally in all forms of infrastructure, what authors like Dodson have called the international infrastructural term. This term also has a qualitative dimension. The perceived completeness and effective functioning of modern infrastructure is frequently used as a symbol of prosperity, of vitality, and as a site of political leadership. The infrastructure term is fueling all forms of speculative urbanism, while pushing the majority of the urban poor across Africa into the so-called informal settlements, an expression of the processes of auto-construction by which ordinary women and men perform everyday city-making across the urban global south. Teresa Caldeira highlights three very important features of these processes. First, they are long-term, incremental, and perennially in the making. Second, they interact transversally with the dominant logics of state regulation, real estate finance, and commodity circulation. Third, through these processes, some, not all, some city makers become fluent in claiming and realizing the right to the city, and in doing so, in expanding their spatial and political agency. These processes are actively at play in the contemporary struggle for some form of sanitation that we see across urban Africa. Yet the things, the pit, the latrines, the buckets, the shovels, the bleach, and the sherry cans that sustain the sanitation systems of the poor are consistently overlooked by sanitation master plans and investments alike. To be clear, building sanitation infrastructure is one thing, but building, running, and maintaining sanitation systems is a different matter, a matter that marks a difference between a facility and a facility that provides a service, and furthermore, between a service as a commodity and one that is sustained through unpaid work and stigmatized bodies and practices. When it comes to women, the emphasis on the notion of safety reduces what sanitation facilities do for them to basic functions. A facility that is clean and where one will not contract diseases. A facility that can be locked and where one would not be sexually harassed or assaulted. A facility that is affordable, and so on. But together with cleanliness, proximity, density, and other desirable characteristics of what makes a facility a source of adequate access to safe sanitation, come other qualities that are usually ignored or overlooked. This means that the focusing on the physical dimension of infrastructure once built and the subsequent social effects it has does not necessarily illuminate the complex socio-technical, legal, spatial, and political economic processes that produce those facilities in the first place. Beyond these formal processes also lie, as we saw in the video, a host of informal and embodied practices of creation, use, and adaptation that comprise what we should call infrastructure. Looking at contemporary social movements, we can see the continuous efforts and role of grassroots women in advocating for, protecting, building, and maintaining infrastructural systems as fundamentally common systems. That is, not just as things that perform a function, but as a relational means of life support. This calls for reconceiving the material world, the things assumed to produce sanitation, as a feminist sociability of radical interdependence, while engaging with the deconstruction of the prevailing binaries that are perpetuated, mirroring the gender binary. I'm talking about the binaries of production and reproduction, public and private, and formal and informal. Now moving to the end, and just to conclude, the three interlinked sites that I briefly examined here open multiple possibilities for other ways of knowing and doing, of seeking sanitation justice and gender equality as one, of opening other imaginaries. Methodologically, it is critical to turn struggles that are experienced and perceived as private and individual into collective ones that live through and outside our bodies and minds. I'm talking here about thinking and practicing liberating methodologies as critical pedagogies, as means of conscientization, instead of awareness raising, education, or other forms of behavioral change so commonly advocated in the field of sanitation. Epistemologically, it is critical to extend our gaze beyond the treatment of disease and the infrastructures that are meant to prevent it, and to denounce how and why they rely on the social construction of deeply gendered sanitation and health inequalities of systems that operate as machineries of stigmatization. What we can see throughout the fieldwork testimonies shared at the beginning, and also through an in-depth exploration of sanitation policies and campaigns, reveals the working of taboos and stigma as both a mechanism and a cause of illness. In other words, well-intentioned interventions and health programs can generate and reproduce stigma and many other unintended consequences for the same groups they aim to serve. For instance, many hygiene and sanitation projects generate social pressure and shame in the name of improved health, exacerbating gender and racial disparities within global health inequalities. I'm referring to programs such as the community-led total sanitation, which are designed for communities to build their own toilets, work by leveraging social pressure and expectations to generate shame, fear, and disgust when desirable prescribed hygiene norms are violated. As a result, individuals in communities, and particularly women, where this approach is implemented, face great stigma and the threat of identity and status devaluation. Put simply, those who cannot afford purchasing a toilet or who continue to practice traditional hygiene norms often receive harsh moral judgment and social and institutional punishment. Furthermore, hygiene stigmas can lead to the emergence not only of epidemics, but also depression and moral devastation, as well as financial strain and debt, when the ability to follow prescribed norms is beyond reach. This has a number of consequences that call for embracing the making and unmaking of deeply gendered sanitation stigmas and taboos. Sanitation and health interventions readily stigmatize their so-called beneficiary subjects, derailing ongoing public health efforts and invariably hurting people who are already at risk, not only physically and mentally, but also by undermining their agency. It is therefore critical to interrogate why infrastructural projects have the differential effects they have and why they often reproduce, amplify, or generate social inequalities. An intersectional approach and interrogation of gender equity and inequity in infrastructure provision, alongside the deployment of critiques of Eurocentric and colonial preferences and practices, has the potential to identify more just orientations for planning practices. In short, feminizing urban struggles involve recognizing stigma elimination as a necessary and core component of all global health and sanitation efforts, as well as developing the sensitivities and alertness to challenge the moral scrutiny and consequent inequalities tied to women's bodies and practices. Thinking through the gender production of sanitation, or we could extend this to housing, food, and many other critical urban lifelines, reveals that the fundamental dynamics of gender difference and hierarchy upon which urban societies are being built. Struggles over these lifelines are simultaneously a race struggle, a class struggle, a women's struggle, an age struggle, and more, all at once. To conclude, and I'm going just to finish, to listen to everyone and engage in the debate, I just want to share a call for action. Throughout the project, the Overdue project, we didn't only focus on producing actionable knowledge, but very much on co-learning, on mobilization and advocacy. And it is in this context that we co-produce a call for action that is called We Crave Sanitation for African Cities. And we invite you all in the link to have a look at the call for action, and if you agree with it, to also endorse it. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for an incredible presentation. Really, really difficult topic, hard, some images hard to see and to think about what you're saying, especially about the men cleaning the chambers. But also enchanting, as we had with Veronica and Miraf having their own, each one of you in how you deal with the topic. We have this word in Portuguese, encantamento, and we also have another term in Portuguese that you bring from the notion of conscientização from Paulo Freire, but also to esperançar, which means that we don't wait for change, but we move towards it. So a gente esperança, we move towards it with hope. And it kept me thinking about it, not to be wishy-washy, but because that's the notion of the struggle as well. But I wanted Claude if Claude wants to comment on this work as well, to give the floor to you, if you want to come in. I don't know if she's ready.
Hello.
She's saying that she would rather wait for others if they have any comments or questions.
Okay.
I think Adriana said it all. I'd rather leave others.
Okay. Paula?
Perdão, eu tô com delay, eu não sei se eu posso falar agora, eu tô com delay da tradução
I
aqui.
apologize, I have a delay for the translation.
Não, alguns comentários. Tem comentário no chat.
Some comments. I have a comment in the chat by Claudie. You're here, Claudie. You could also make that comment. I think it would be nice. And we also have a comment by that's thanking Adriana for the content, for the topic of the discussion, and talking about the inspiration for the presentation. Two observations, Adriana. First, thank you for your intervention. And it's impressive how do you bring this as an intersectional debate that shows that cleaning is an invisible work for women who clean, and you also bring the men, very precarious bodies, and there's an invisibility of who cleans the city, who cleans the urban spaces, the houses, and you bring an intersectional outlook, which is wonderful and also very impressive, very impressive. And I was thinking, and I wanted to bring you a question. In Brazil, currently, we have seen very strongly a debate about the creation of policy for housing improvement, a policy that thinks about the resources from the states to the companies that do renovations of bathrooms, for example, in the houses, in urbanized spaces. And there are two forms of reading these actions. And one, these companies are where the state can't reach. The state urbanizes a slum, but they don't take care of the inside of the household. So calling for the need for the state to get involved in the construction of bathrooms. On the other hand, there is a criticism, which is that these policies feed into financiarization processes of the family's debts, because these companies charge the families that already live in precarious places to build toilets, and then they sell that resource in a financial market. So they financialize that debt, of course, with social credit and things like that. But the major criticism is, well, the goal of these company of obtaining income outside of the formal market, recognizing a sea of informality that people who don't have access to that infrastructure, and on the other hand, an absence of the state, which doesn't take that infrastructure to those regions. So how can we avoid this mercantilization? Do you know processes of building infrastructures that are collective, that are not mercantile, that leave the resources in the precarious and informal markets and don't cause the bankarization? I'm sorry for going on for too long, but I had to explain the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. I don't know if you want to take any more comments or observations, or I should go for it, or you tell me. Yeah.
Maybe because we have so little, I'll make a few more comments.
Sure.
I'm gonna ask you what I'm gonna make a comment as well. So
maybe Claudia would like to do some comments. Do you?
Paula, Claudia said that she wanted to hear the comments, that Adriana said it all and that she wanted to listen. Unless you've changed.
Okay, let's go.
Otherwise,
Let's go, Adriana.
Claudia. Open the camera if you want to come in as well, please. Raquel Coutinho, who is here, she was saying it's more of a comment that it would be really interesting to make a comparison with the condition of the cities in Latin America. Claudia was saying really interesting, because we were talking here about the precarity that the men are, the conditions of the men, but Claudia was saying that they are paid for the service and the women are not paid for those services. I wanted to say, my empirical work is in Tanzania, working with women that build biofuel toilets, which is an alternative to the pit latrines. And those were while I was taking. So this is the delivery of a biofuel toilet that we helped the women from the Federation build as part of our action research. And I just wanted to show this very strong moment. And then another time in the same community where we were discussing with women, what else do we do besides the construction of the toilets? And I mentioned this in the first state that it's struggle, but it's also hope. But back to you, Adriana.
Sure. Let me just start, and I just mentioned, because we have Claudie, but also Nadine, who are both members of the team. I'm going to also make some time or keep a space for them also to chip in, because I'm sure they have much more to add to what I said. And just perhaps to add that actually I didn't share that today, but a large part of the project actually focused on doing things differently, including experimentation with toilets that can close the loop and making sure that women can regain control over things and their bodies through those new things and objects. So there is a lot that we could share, perhaps not today, but a lot to share on that front as well. So perhaps on two of the other points, the point that Paula was making in terms of housing and what we see increasingly as a process, even in the face of state-led housing, the process of course, you know, just subsidizing the private sector, you know, and to produce an affordable housing, a model that we see clearly all over the world and clearly as well in Latin America. I think that here, Paula, what is important to think about is about the difference, something that someone who, a very dear maestro who died recently, Sean Turner, used to say, housing is a verb, not a thing. And I think I was trying to do something similar with sanitation. Sanitation is a verb, not a thing, I would say. And this idea, I mean, clearly what this refers us to is to the fact that actually it's not about building a thing, building a roof. It's about the creation, the production of a dwelling, a space for dwelling, a space that performs not just a externally prescribed function of protecting us from, you know, sheltering us from the rain and the bad weather and so on, but much more than that. I think that the key answer to your question, Paula, lives in what we know and is very advanced everywhere, but particularly in the context of Latin America, which is the difference between housing as produced, public housing, social housing as produced by the state or subsidized by the state and produced and constructed by the private sector on the basis, of course, of financial gains, vis-a-vis what we call the social production of habitat. And what we know is that the processes of the social production of habitat also have a critical key for that how do you call it, Priscilla? Building of hope, if you wish, building of agency. And this goes beyond the idea of self-help build housing, self-help build toilets, and so on. This is talking about processes by which grassroots women and men have control over the dwellings, over their housing, over their sanitation. This is something that in Latin America has been pushed for a long time through far more advanced policies. And actually right now there is a new generation of policies pushed by grassroots actors in Argentina, in Brazil, and in Venezuela that are precisely trying to make this a state policy. Yeah. So could, you know, and it has happened in the past, to make the social production of habitat and the social production of housing not something that people do on their own, but a matter of state intervention, a matter of state financial deployment and so on. And in a way, I think that we also need to think about sanitation exactly in the same way. There was you made a comment about intersectionality, Paula, and I think that also we didn't have time, but there are so many other dimensions, important dimensions to think about, like for instance, that of being a tenant. I didn't speak at all about that, but it's a systematically overlooked condition. It makes a big difference if you are a tenant, a woman and a tenant in an informal settlement, and if you are the landlord or the landlady, even if you don't have a deed or a title. Again, much more to say, but to keep on thinking about the multiple intersections that we need to keep unpacking. I'm going to stop here because I know that there is, I want to at least give a couple of minutes to Nadine and Claudie. And just to one of the comments on the chat, definitely the power of comparative research is enormous. And I think that is enormous in generating not of a comparison of like to like, but much more generative questions. Sometimes looking at things that look really radically different allows us to ask questions that we wouldn't ask otherwise. I leave a space also for Claudie and Nadine.
Claudie and Nadine, we are calling you to participate.
Can see that. I wanted to be quiet, but it's impossible.
Claudie, tell us more about the glossary, perhaps if you want.
Yeah, well, we're just finishing it. It's been a very, very interesting experience. looking at all the concepts and the terminology that is being used to work on sanitation in Senegal, which is a very kind of, in terms of language, Wolof is the main language, but all the documentation, all the technical, all the political stuff is produced in French. And so it was really interesting during the research to identify those terms that people were using to really describe, their daily experience with sanitation and women in particular. So we've got a whole glossary. Well, it's a modest glossary. I think we've got about 19 or 20 entry points, and we worked on it with the University of Saint Louis, the linguistic department, and they were fascinated to get their students to work on that because it's a very unusual topic for them. So it's been really, really, really interesting because it's also a way of reframing the conversation, anchoring the conversation in the local, not just the local language, but the local experience, using the particular words that people use, and particularly looking at the evolution of some of the terms that people are using to describe, and all the conversations that were happening, between the various groups, the women, the younger one, the older one, to put words on certain realities. And also there was quite a bit of an intersectional approach to that as well. So it's written in French, but maybe one day we'll find means to translate it into English. Why not? And we had a similar exercise in one of our co-learning session, and we actually gathered terms from not just Senegal, but from the 7 countries to describe, exactly what Adriana has been talking about, the bodies, the things, the practices. Yeah, it's been a very interesting project. I encourage all of you to look at the website, and we have so many interesting films. This was just a selection that Nadine put together, but we've got some very interesting testimonies from the 7 countries.
Thanks, Lodi. And indeed, actually, the glossary that we produced through the co-learning space that we ran in July adds many more beyond the 7 cities, because there were participants. I can't remember, Nadine, how many additional cities, but we went from the 7 cities into a much wider community of practice. And that community of practice is the one that crafted together this call for action. We crave just sanitation for African cities. So again, another call, an appeal to read it, and if you agree with it, to endorse it. We are trying to make a big noise and push it for the World Toilet Day on the 19th of November. I just thought also that it might be a good moment before we close, to invite you all to another co-learning space. Tomorrow we are starting a series of 4 sessions of a co-learning space, and when I say we, I mean HIC, the Habitat International Coalition, on the social production of habitat, where we are going to precisely be talking about many of the questions that particularly Paula raised, and talking to multiple people from social movements from every corner of the world, talking precisely about what the social production of habitat and of housing means, how it works, and how it's being pushed, and with what results. So you're all most welcome to join us, and perhaps I think that perhaps Felisa, or I don't know if Diana or anyone else from HIC can share on the chat how to join the sessions. I stop with all the advertising, sorry.